Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody is doing well and another weekend perspective. We are into the middle of November. Hard to believe it. We literally only have 6 weeks left in the year. Leaves are falling. Temperatures are dropping all over the place. We are not far from Thanksgiving, which is, in my opinion, the best holiday of the year, at least here in the United States. Football season is in full swing, both in the NFL and college football and things that most of the world probably doesn't care about, but is very important to us. I want to dive into, today's topic or topics. And I spent the last week or so, and apologize for missing the show a couple of weeks ago. It was just one of those weekends where I had planned to put something together and was traveling some, and just kind of wore me out. So apologize for you guys missing the show on the first of the month. Anyways, was kind of thinking all week about like what should I talk about this week? What topics are jumping to mind? What kind of trends and things are jumping to mind? And as I mentioned a bunch of times in the show, the thing with the weekend perspectives is sometimes I'll have a very distinct topic I want to get into. It could be a historical thing. It could be, a specific thing that happened in the week or a couple of weeks before. And then sometimes, I'm sort of looking at a couple of different things and sometimes trying to figure out if there's a through line between them, any symmetry between them, any, kind of yins and yangs that we can find between them. And this past week, as I was thinking about things, I just kind of kept coming back to this thought that, and again, you never know when we're at a tipping point. You never know when we're at an inflection point. You never know when we're really at the beginning of an era or the end of an era. But it did feel like we're at a stage where there's a lot of things that are uncertain. And I was kind of, looking through a whole bunch of things. So I thought what might be sort of interesting is to sort of dive into some of the areas, at least from a tech perspective, that feel somewhat uncertain or at least feel transitioning. And the reason this was interesting to me is, as I've thought back on, a bunch of transitions that we've seen, oftentimes economic driven, sometimes driven by other things, pandemic and other stuff. Oftentimes we sort of go, okay, this is what we think will happen because this is the trajectory we've been on. And oftentimes what ends up happening, especially when things are, kind of uncertain from an economic perspective or uncertain from a technology perspective, is we see some people get really creative and come up with things that, maybe weren't necessarily on our radar, but, in hindsight, make a ton of sense. And so I thought what may be sort of interesting is to dig into some of these areas we've got uncertainty and maybe, kind of speculate out what might be some of the interesting things that come out of that. So anyways, here's my list. And again, I apologize. I do feel like sometimes when I do these ones where I make a list of stuff that it would be easy for the audience to go, okay, this is just him sort of phoning it in. He did a listicle, he's got really nothing to say. I've been thinking about this one for a while. And again, may or may not be the best one we ever do, but, apologize up front a little bit. I don't ever sort of phone these in as sort of a listicle. In fact, I respect the audience too much. I probably would just say, look, I'm not going to do one that week if the best I can do is a listicle. But these are sort of things that have been in my mind in terms of uncertainty, and then looking at them and going, where could they go? What's the possibilities here? So the first thing on my list, and again, sort of apologies, we've always tried very, very hard not to make this show about politics. The reality is politics are, part of everyday life. And at least here in the States, anytime we go through an election every 4 years, not so much the ones every 2 years, but every 4 years, there is the possibility that the very big swings happen. And so, right now, the U.S. is going through a transition, a fairly significant transition from, kind of one ideology within the power to a very, I don't want to say really different, but, potentially significantly different ideology. And from a tech perspective, that could potentially mean a lot of different things, right? It's going to have impact on regulation. We know people are concerned about AI regulation, but it could have other ramifications in terms of chip regulation. We've got, certain restrictions on things like, working with Chinese companies and, some of the chips that may be involved, both U.S. companies being able to sell to different parts of the world, as well as the U.S. being able to interact or even integrate with certain technologies and so forth. So there's possibility that some of that changes. There is uncertainty about what will be the leadership, who will be the leadership. Obviously, we know who the president and some of the elected leaders are, but their chosen picks are kind of going through the process, and there's quite a bit of uncertainty around that. There's uncertainty both from who they've chosen to potentially be the lead person versus who will actually be validated into that role or certified in that role. So anytime there's uncertainty around that, it's going to leave people typically in those types of situations in which they tend not to act. But in some cases, depending on who gets picked, you have a pretty good sense of like what direction will they take a segment of the industry or of the economy and so forth, especially important around things like antitrust. There is a lot of speculation as to the current view on antitrust or on mergers and acquisitions. Will that change quite a bit? That can have a fairly big thing. And then I think the last question that feels like an uncertainty is this current administration considered sort of a friend or foe of Silicon Valley? In the past, Silicon Valley has sort of enjoyed the idea that they sort of stayed away from the political landscape somewhat, as long as they were geographically fairly far away from Washington D.C. But also they tended to sort of enjoy having sort of a laissez-faire relationship. A lot of that has changed over the last 10 plus years or so, both in terms of regulation, in terms of lots of things. So I think Silicon Valley is trying to figure out, will this be a pick and choose friend or foe with Silicon Valley? Will this be, kind of more friendly because Silicon Valley is sort of deemed to be business and the current administration is tend to be more business friendly? A lot of that is still up in the air. Okay, enough of the politics. I think the second piece that a lot of people are trying to figure out is when we look at the current stock market, and again, apologize, some of this is going to feel like a very U.S. centric thing. I extrapolate that out that yes, many things are regional and regionality matters, but the U.S. is still the largest market in terms of financial markets and credit markets and so forth. And again, it's the thing that's most visible from our side of things. I think the market is sort of in a little bit of uncertainty in terms of the market has been very bullish over the last 4 years, really kind of since the pandemic, since about 2021, the market has been up quite a bit, at least the broader stock market and obviously technology markets. But and after the election, the markets kind of bumped up, people saying, okay, we feel like this is good for business environments. But the credit markets, the debt markets, the interest rates and so forth aren't aligned to that. And so there is a lot of sort of speculation or undue uncertainty around, what will things like inflation, what will some of the regulation that comes out of it, whether they're tariffs or whether they're, pushing in one direction or the other. So I think, people are going to be a little bit uncertain. And again, that uncertainty oftentimes, especially in the tech industry, leads to, just kind of people sitting on their hands, not necessarily making as decisive moves in terms of buying and in terms of funding projects and so forth until there feels like some level of uncertainty. And it does feel like this is something that might take, quarter, end of this year, quarter into next year to really kind of get a sense of which way the winds are sort of blowing there. So from an economic perspective, while things feel and have been mostly positive over the last 3 or 4 years, 3 years plus, it does feel like there is a level of uncertainty from a longer term perspective that will, kind of need to kind of have some things finalized or, kind of brought clear into picture. All right, as we get more into the actual technology stuff as opposed to just purely politics and economics, this past week has been interesting. We've seen the tech industry in particular had always been very heavily concentrated around Twitter in terms of how we communicated, ways in which we got sort of real-time information, had discussions. That doesn't mean there isn't tons of other forums, Reddit and Slacker, Stack Overflow, and all sorts of things in which people found information, podcasts in particular. But it does feel like the exodus from Twitter, which was very, very large this week in terms, especially around the tech community, we've seen quite a bit, to things like Threads and Blue Sky. It does feel like we are at a very, I don't want to say uncertain time, but maybe much more fragmented time than we've been over the last, 7 or 8 years, just in terms of, where people are going to find information. And it's a weird thing to say because we live at a time when there is so much information at our fingertips. It is readily available, it is freely available. But Twitter was really sort of an interesting, powerful tool in terms of really just kind of being a place you could go, you could find, you could discover, you could lurk, you could make friends, you could find community, you could learn about new things. And it does feel like it is somewhat more fragmented now as people are both figuring out which new thing do they like. Again, whether it's TikTok or Blue Sky or Instagram or, wherever, it could be Mastodon or something. But also a lot of the kind of followings and groupings and things that we used to use don't necessarily translate easily. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see how people are learning, how much we see of people being willing to share versus people being willing to share, people being willing to share freely versus people now deciding everybody is a creator and a curator and they need to do things professionally. That's going to sort of change the dynamic. So I think kind of what this means, I don't want to speculate whether it's good or bad that we have this fragmentation. I think sometimes fragmentation is good. It creates a lot of creativity, creates a lot of competition. But I think we will see a little bit of people trying to figure out how they get information and some gaps and stuff that were much easier to do when kind of everybody was around the Twitter water cooler, if you will. Another thing we've seen a lot of speculation about here, just even in the last couple of weeks, is the speculation that amongst the largest companies, the Groks and the Open AIs and Google and a few others, that they're starting to hit somewhat of a plateau on these largest AI LLM models. And there's been speculation that this may happen, for a few months, especially as people started to say, well, models are only going to continue to get better, based on how much information they can kind of hoover up and consume and ingest into their models. And obviously, they've been doing an incredible job of doing that for a very long time. So, there's been speculation that, will there be enough new data to force into these models to make them get increasingly better? I think the flip side that I've seen from this that's really sort of interesting and, something that we speculated on the last Cloud News of the Month, if you were listening, is, what are going to be those new things that you can do from these LLMs beyond just chatbots and, developer assistants, co-pilots, those types of things. And it will be interesting to see if we start to see a kind of a blooming, most likely, let 10,000 flowers bloom of people really starting to focus less on models, less on model training, less on trying to take in huge amounts of money for models, and much more around building applications and also reducing the cost of inferencing. And so, it does, I don't want to speculate. I know the news loves to jump on, hey, the models are slowing down or whatever. And that may or may not be the case. It might just be that we got, a little bit addicted to this idea that there'd be a new, frontier model every couple of months. And the reality is like, these models are so big that the next frontier one might not come out for 9 months or 12 months or something. But it will be really interesting to see if we start to see real blooming of applications, just kind of in the same way that we did when the smartphones first started coming out. You'd have to go back to 2007, but they weren't loaded up with applications at the time. It was really more the idea that the most powerful thing is you have the internet in your pocket. You're no longer sort of tethered to, a big device or to a wire or a cable or power or any of that sort of thing. And then it took a few years. And then there was this realization of like, oh no, the power of the smartphone is in the applications. It's not just in, having all of your music with you or, this cool screen. It was in the applications, and the applications that spawned out of that, were things that didn't necessarily seem obvious when it first sort of came out. So it'll be really interesting to sort of see if that trend begins to happen as much more funding, much more creativity starts to fall into the application side of AI and LLMs, and maybe less attention, less differentiation, less funding maybe starts to go into the building and training of those LLMs. So that'll be interesting. Next thing I had on my list, and this will be really interesting to kind of validate or invalidate here in a couple of weeks when AWS reInvent comes along. But I feel like we're at an interesting tipping point with the cloud providers because we just had all of them announce their earnings. All of them continue to do well, whether they fully hit their numbers or slightly miss their numbers. I mean, all of them are back to larger double-digit growth, right? So we've seen everything from 20 plus to 30 plus to 40 plus % growth, across the board for the various cloud providers. But what's interesting is they really kind of no longer talk about cloud. The innovation that they talk about is very little about cloud. And we've been talking about this now, it feels like for almost a couple of years. But until sort of the Gen AI thing came along about a year ago, there wasn't necessarily what's going to kind of replace this? And the reason I bring this up is, it's very, very possible that the massive amounts of investment they're going to make, if it happens to coincidentally align with, a whole bunch of new applications being built, really good for the cloud providers. I think the other way to think about this is if cloud is now sort of perceived as being boring, if you will, and that's absolutely the wrong word, but perceived as being, kind of steady state, whatever, we very well may start seeing people get very creative. And again, they may not get as much headlines, it may not be as sexy, but start to see some really innovative, operational types of things, cost savings types of things, efficiency types of things, the same way that people always do whenever you have sort of steady state businesses and you're looking to, take cost out of the system while continuing to provide a certain level of quality and all that sort of stuff. So I'll be very interested to see if, the Matt Garmans of the world, come out this year or even beginning of next year are still primarily focused on sort of AI, because obviously it's sort of in a boom and we haven't seen that bubble burst or anything like that. But do we start to see a sort of second undertow of people who are starting to look at the cloud opportunity, especially like in the public cloud, but maybe even, cross-cloud, multi-cloud, hybrid cloud types of things, and start to try and innovate in new ways that they didn't do before because they were kind of chasing the number of features that were coming out from a cloud perspective, in AWS, Azure, and Google. So I think that'll be really interesting to see is the cloud providers are still making a lot of money. Obviously, that funds and allows them to continue to advance and expand in a lot of ways. But do we continue to see, at least as much innovation or new ideas put into running the cloud, managing the cloud, adopting the cloud, migrating to the cloud, modernizing in the cloud, as we do just around AI? So I think that'll be very, very interesting. Second to last thing I had on my list is VCs seem to be very, very excited about and again, this is, I think, from a political perspective, because we've got a change of leadership, very excited about the potential of acquisitions again. Now, I think the thing that's interesting here is we're kind of at a transitionary period between, the VCs putting a ton of money into AI, but not yet quite finding what the business case is for sustainable AI. And I don't mean sustainable in the like power and cooling sense, but like, finding sustainable business models, profitable business models, even that much. Or do we also see a big run up in the 2020, 2021, 2022 set of startups who took a ton of funding? Most of them didn't tend to work out or haven't necessarily, found great market fit, or at least haven't found, the ability to monetize their stuff at a profitable level. Do we start to see a whole bunch of those companies get acquired? And again, they could easily sort of roll over to private equity, but they don't really fit the mold of private equity in terms of having a bunch of cash, but, kind of falling out of favor in terms of being, sort of sexy and cutting edge. But we may very well see a whole bunch of these companies, the 2020, 2021, 2022 unicorns or so-called unicorns start to get acquired by, the larger companies. Could be Cisco, could be Oracle, could be Microsoft, could be IBM, could be Red Hat, could be VM, Broadcom, could be, any of the, more established large players in the IT space, who potentially could pick up a whole bunch of talent and or some interesting technology, at, basically pennies on the dollar, right? Fire sales for VCs to get back some of their money. So I think that'll be interesting. Or, are all the acquisitions really, kind of following this trend of like spinning in, big names from the AI perspective, data scientists, data analysts, data people. So it'd be interesting to see if that happens. And the last thing I had in the sort of uncertainty thing, I don't know if this is an uncertainty thing or fragmentation thing or whatever, but for anybody who happened to have tuned into the Mike Tyson versus Jake Paul boxing match, or I don't even know if it should have been called a boxing match. It was sort of a great con to get all of us to believe that, somebody who was great at one time could still be great 30 years later type of thing. But what was really interesting, I think, from a technology perspective, was Netflix was hosting this event, big, huge kind of, sporting slash social event. And, I think we all sort of, having lived through the growth of the cloud and seen all the talks, about how amazing the technology was that Netflix delivered, and then seeing it scale, when the pandemic happened, when everybody was home and their user rates went through the roof. I think we had just taken for granted that, Netflix, really kind of knew how to do all sorts of technology stuff. They could figure out internet scale things. And it was really interesting last night to watch how, unfortunately, it underperformed when it, was sort of at peak levels. There was all sorts of stalling and poor quality of the stream and so forth. So I only highlight that just because it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see if, as the way we watch and consume media begins to change, and people are trying to figure out, should I be in the streaming business, for things like movies and video and stuff, which easily kind of can push out to CDNs and other types of stuff, or are the premiums around things like, live events, as we've seen some of the internet companies dabble in. Amazon's probably dabbled in it the most with things like Thursday Night Football and so forth. But it sort of does point out it's not as easy as it would perceive to be. And what was really interesting was, Netflix is very much, tied up to Amazon's infrastructure. Amazon has figured out how to do this through things like, Amazon Prime and Thursday Night Football and so forth. But it isn't just sort of plug and play. So I only highlight that because it will be interesting, as the streaming companies figure out what their next steps are, and, are live events really a big deal, whether it's like concerts or sporting events or whatever it might be, how challenging that could potentially be technically. And I think a lot of us just sort of assumed that because people had Amazon had figured it out and Netflix had already shown us they could scale, that would just be an easy transition. And obviously not as easy as may have been perceived. So anyways, don't know all the technical details there. It'll be interesting to see if there's a post-mortem that comes out from Netflix about, what some of the struggles were in being able to deliver that. So anyways, lots of uncertainty that very well might just be very short term, right? This stuff may all be cleared up by, the end of the year or first quarter or second quarter of next year. But I do feel like a lot of these sort of, unknowns, uncertainty, fragmentation are definitely opportunities for some new creative thinking, right? To sort of say, hey, the old way of thinking under different circumstances, economics, political leadership, biggest company in the room type of thing, may not necessarily all be the same. And it'll be really interesting to see what sort of creative ideas people start to come out with as we move into 2025 and beyond. So anyways, hope you all are doing well. Hope your November is going well. And thank you all for listening as always. Thank you all for telling a friend about the show. Thank you for sending in your ideas and so forth. We are getting close to wrapping up the year. We will have, a few more shows for the year. We're going to try and do, same normal Sunday and Wednesday. We will, get out shows around the holidays, Thanksgiving and Christmas. We will do year-end wrap-up. We will do a big show around AWS reInvent, depending on how it goes. And then we'll jump into next year. We've got a whole bunch of interesting guests already starting to line up for that. So anyways, thank you all for listening. Thanks for helping us, spread the knowledge of the show to different communities. We are now on Blue Sky. For those of you that follow along, we are Cloudcast Pod, just as we have been on Twitter and other things. So if you want to follow us there, we'd love to see you over there as well. So with that, we'll wrap it up. Talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.